Okay, good evening, everybody.
Hi.
Hi, how are you, Rabbi Yoel? And
Baruch Hashem.
online. It's great to see you.
Did you have a class last week?
What's that?
Did you have a class last week?
We had Thursday night. I had to postpone it from Monday night because I wasn't available.
I didn't even know.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
You have to email me. I won't see it otherwise.
Yeah, I think I emailed, but I may have emailed a little too late. But yeah, I'm sorry. Should have.
Okay. So I'll look for it on YouTube, on
it's not on Facebook. No, it's not on Facebook. We're having technical problems last week with, and even this week we're having technical problems. That's why I'm still from using another computer. Whatever. We still have to resolve them. We're in touch with Zoom, and we're having some security issues with the camera, with the microphone, or whatever.
Oh. Okay.
Anyway, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's lesson, line in the sand, sometimes you must be unequivocal, is all about sometimes it's necessary to take a stand and be very clear about it and not waver and not try to compromise in some aspects, depending on where, obviously. But they say, the problem with sitting on the fence. You know what the problem is with sitting on a fence? The problem with sitting on a fence is it starts to hurt after a while. That's what they say. What's the point? The point is that sometimes it's necessary to get off the fence and stand on one side of the fence. Now, this week's Parshas, Parshas Va'eda, and Parshas Va'eda and Parshas Boi. Parshas Va'eda and Parshas Boi are the two Parshas that deal with the 10 plagues. Anybody familiar with the story of the Exodus knows that there were 10 plagues that God wrought upon the Egyptian people and the Egyptian economy, completely devastating it. And the name Va'eda, I just want to point out, the name Va'eda is comprised of 4 letters. The first 2 is Vav. Vav has a numerical value of 6, and Aleph has a numerical value, of course, of 1. 6 plus 1 is 7, and the Parsha of Va'eda deals with 7 of the Makkahs, 7 of the plagues that God brought upon Egypt. Then, after that, we have Parshas Boi, which is next week's Parsha. Parshas Boi has the numerical value of Beis. Beis is 2, Aleph is 1, so that's 3. And the final 3 plagues that God brought upon the Egyptians is dealt with in Parshas Boi. Okay, so this week we have all the different plagues that Hashem brings. We're going to focus on plague number 4 for a moment. We'll go back to the first 3 soon. First, we're going to talk about the plague number 4. Here's what the Torah tells us in text number 1 in Shemos, Perek Ches, Pasuk Yud Ches. Here's what the Torah tells us. And I will separate on that day the land of Goshen, upon which my people stand. There will be no mixture of noxious creatures there, in order that you know that I am God in the midst of the earth. What's happening here is the Torah is telling us, or God is saying, that once the 4th plague came, there was no longer any spread of the plague in the land of Goshen. In other words, it's implying that what happened until plague number 4, during plague number 1, 2, 3, there was some of the plague, or the plague did apply to the land of Goshen, which is the land where the Jews lived. So in other words, what seems to be implied here is that for the first 3 of the 10 plagues, the Jewish people suffered as well. That's what seems to be implied by this verse, at least according to some commentaries, as we'll see in a moment. So there's the famous commentary. His name is the Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra. And he says, he reads this verse straightforward, and he says, the plague was brought upon the Jewish people as well, the first 3, and it was only by plague number 4, where the wild animals came and attacked the Egyptians. That's when the Jewish people were separate. Here's what he says. And they dug. He says, and they dug. This is referring to the first of the 10 plagues. Many said that the water that was red like blood when in the hand of an Egyptian became clear in the hand of a Hebrew. If that is so, why is this miracle not recorded in the Torah? He has a very obvious question. He says, if you're going to take that position, that indeed the Jewish people were spared in the first of the 3 plagues, they were spared of the plagues, so why doesn't the Torah record that very clearly, that when, for instance, a Hebrew and an Egyptian switched, let's say an Egyptian was holding some water that looked like blood, or that was blood, that then turned to blood, and then he handed it over to a Jew. So if it miraculously turned into water while he was holding it, so why doesn't the Torah mention anything of it? Continues the Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra, says, in my view, following from the simple meaning of the scriptures, the plagues of blood, frogs, and lice, meaning the first 3, included the Egyptians and the Hebrews. These 3 plagues did not cause much harm, only for the plague of the wild animals, which was more destructive, and subsequent plagues did God distinguish between the Egyptians and Israel. So according to the Ibn Ezra, the Jewish people had suffered the same lot as the Egyptians during the first 3 plagues, which is quite a novelty, because so many of the other commentaries disagree, as we're going to see soon. Rabbeinu Bachya, Ramban, by the way, was the Rebbe of Rabbeinu Bachya. He was the teacher of Rabbeinu Bachya, and a number of others. We're going to see soon the Rambam. Many others seem to disagree with the position of the Ibn Ezra that the Jews suffered the same fate as the Egyptians during the first 3. And to be honest, growing up and learning this in Cheder, we always assumed that this was the case. The Jews were spared all the 10 plagues. It was only brought upon the Egyptians. So, what would possibly be the explanation for the idea that that the Jewish people in other words, like this. Let's go back for a second to the first text. Let's go back to the first text, because I think it's important to understand. Here we have the Torah saying, with regard to the 4th plague, that now God is saying, I will separate on that day the land of Goshen. So it seems like only from the 4th plague and onwards, that's when there's going to be some kind of separation. So if you are arguing that the Jewish people were spared the first 3 plagues, why would the Torah suddenly now say that there's going to be some kind of difference? And what is the Torah really implying? What kind of difference could there have been if the Jewish people had been spared? If there were no plagues for the Jewish people for the first 3 times, for the first 3 plagues, then how would the 4th plague be any different? So some explain as follows. Some say that what this means here is that lice, bloody water, frogs are all a local issue. It's something that could be contained or could be heard about locally. But wild animals, bands of wild animals wandering around and scaring society, you would know about that if it happened. And so when it came to the 4th one, that's when people realized that the Jewish people were being spared. It's not that they weren't being spared before. They were being spared before also. They didn't have blood, they didn't have lice, they didn't have the tzfardeh, they didn't have the frogs. But it was only by the time it came to the 4th one, to the 4th plague, that's when it became obvious to everybody that the Jewish people were being spared. That's the way they explained it. The other commentaries explain the verse that we just took a look at over here in text number 1. So let's move to text number 3 and see how Rabbeinu Bachya in fact explains this. And I will separate on that day, so says Rabbeinu Bachya, inasmuch as the first plagues were relatively stationary, it was unremarkable that they occurred in the central part of Egypt and not in Goshen where the Jews lived. By contrast, wild animals wreak havoc everywhere. When these beasts came on God's command from the desert to destroy everything, it's only natural that they would reach Goshen as well, since it was also part of the land of Egypt. The Jews were only spared because of a miracle from God. So in other words, the way the Rabbeinu Bachya is explaining things, the reason why the reason why the Torah is saying that the Jews would be separated is not because until now they weren't separated. It's that now it would become obvious to everybody that they're being separated. So that's the way they understand things. Now, this isn't it. This isn't the only thing. I'm just going to drink a little bit of tea. I made a bracha earlier. L'chaim. We should all be well. And so now let's move to some more vigorous argumentation against the Ibn Ezra, presented by the Radvaz. Radvaz, Rabbi David Ibn Zimra, was one of the great medieval scholars. He lived from 1479 to 1573. He's the author of prolific work, multiple works actually, some in halacha, some in mystical works like Kabbalah. He wrote a sefer called Migdal David in Kabbalah and on the mitzvahs. Very interesting author and fantastic work. But anyway, let's move to his argument here against the Rabbeinu Ibn Ezra. Okay, so text number 4. Rabbi Ibn Ezra writes that. Can you hear me? Just make sure you can hear me. Yeah. Okay. Good. So Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra writes that Egypt and Israel were both subject to the plagues of blood, frogs, and lice. It's forbidden to believe. He's very, very, very adamant. He says it's forbidden to believe such a thing, especially since Scripture itself indicates the opposite. The Scripture says, "And Egypt could not drink water from the river." You see that? And Egypt cannot drink water from the river. And all of Egypt dug around the river. The implication being that the Israelites did not need to do this, since they were drinking from the river's waters. So the Radvaz wants to emphasize these words here, where the Torah says, "And Egypt could not drink. All of Egypt dug around the river." This seems to imply that it was not the Jewish people, to exclude the Jewish people. Now, it's not the only argument that the Radvaz puts forward. Let's see the other one. The other one seems to be a little bit more forceful, a little bit more compelling. And he says like this, "And so it is said, when Moshe warned of the frogs that they will come up into you and into your people, and then later that they will depart from you and from your houses and from your servants and from your people," implied is that they were not in Israel. The same is true of the lice. From where it is clear, we can infer to where it is not clear. What he's saying is that, again, from the text, it would seem to imply that it did not apply to the Jews, it did not hit the Jews. But then he has another argument. He says, "I fail to understand. If the plague was also on Israel, then what proof did it hold for Pharaoh that he should send the Israelites from his land? I shouldn't have bothered wasting ink." You hear this? "I shouldn't have bothered wasting ink on this sort of thing. But I did not want to give any space to those who speak falsely regarding the words of our sages." So he's very emphatic, very adamant in his position that the Jewish people were not subject to the 10 plagues, to any of the plagues, whereas Ibn Ezra holds that the first 3 they were subject to. And the Radvaz makes quite a compelling case by saying, number one, from the text, it seems to be clear that the Jews did not suffer from the 10 plagues. Number 2, if they did suffer, and here's his real argument, is if they did suffer, then what message did that send to Pharaoh? If everybody's suffering, the Jews as well, then why would Pharaoh take any of this seriously? Everybody's suffering, finished. Not my people, everybody, even the Jews. So the first question that he poses, which is based on the text, so we can answer, in other words, the first question here that he's asking, that from the text itself, it seems like the Torah is indicating when it says, let's say, "And Egypt could not drink. All of Egypt dug around the river." And then it says that they will come up into you and into your people. So if that means also the Jews, then why would they not be mentioned? Why is it emphasized that that it's talking about the Egyptians. So to that question, we could answer and say that here the Torah is concerned primarily about the effect that it had on the Egyptians, because it's focused on the Egyptians and what Sardea, what the frogs, inundation of frogs is going to do to the Egyptian household or to the Egyptian economy. So the Torah focuses on, it's going to be into you, it's going to come into you, into your people, etc., and therefore makes no mention of the Israelites. But his second question seems to be a lot stronger. His second question seems to be that what message would it be sending to Pharaoh if the Jewish people were suffering from the first 3 plagues? What message would that be? And why would God allow the Jewish people to suffer from those? There's a interesting kind of intermediary opinion of the Rambam, of Maimonides, and here's what he says. Maimonides says as follows. Let's see where Maimonides is here. Here's Maimonides. For every plague that God brought upon the Egyptians, the Torah's language indicates that it was on the Egyptians, except for the plague of lice. While it is not stated explicitly, it is known that the lice did affect the Jews, but not as a punishment, and so it did not actually cause any suffering. The Rambam has kind of an intermediary opinion here, where he says that lice somewhat affected the Jews. The plague of lice did. Okay. Now, there's another interesting twist before we get to answering the question and discussing the main point of the class here. There's a very nice twist here from the Baal Shem Tov. Are you guys ready for the Baal Shem Tov? You can just raise your hand and say, yeah, sure, Baal Shem Tov, absolutely. Okay, so here's the story from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov the Baal Shem Tov explains that sometimes there are things that come in the world, that happen in the world, that are both good and bad. They are bad, and yet there's also another side of them that's good. It's kind of like a chameleon. It could be evil to one and good to another. So, for example, when it comes to the Tzvardeya, when it comes to the let's see if we have a PowerPoint here for that. I don't think so. When it comes to the Tzvardeya, so the Tzvardeya, the word Tzvardeya could be split into 2. Tzvardeya. Tzvardeya means, you can translate it in Hebrew. There's one way of translating it, as meaning brilliant or shining understanding. Deya as understanding, like da'as. And Tzvardeya, at the same time, if you put both words together, means obviously frogs. So it could be that there was an experience that was openly, obviously, when it came to the Egyptians, was a destructive thing, a negative thing, and yet it had another side that had a positive result, that brought with it a positive result. Take a look in text over here, text number 6. Let's see how the Baal Shem Tov explains it. This is written by a student of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is known not to have written really anything on his own. His students wrote in his name. So he says, I heard in the name of my teacher that the 10 plagues were directed at Pharaoh specifically, for Pharaoh is associated with forgetfulness of spirituality. For example, the plague of Tzvardeya, the plague of frogs, the root word safar indicates a light, as in the Aramaic for a bright morning, like safra nohir. Deya, meaning knowledge, is the opposite of forgetfulness, which is called Pharaoh. Thus, it came as a plague to Pharaoh. But for Israel, it was safar deya. And understanding this, and there is a charm, and there's charm in the words of the wise. Understand this, and there's charm in the words of the wise. That's a literal translation of the Hebrew words, which are usually written at the end of a commentary, the end of a statement, which is, if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense. Point is here that the Baal Shem Tov is saying that the Jewish people were affected by the 10 plagues, but by them it was a good effect. It was a positive result, whereas with regard to the Egyptians, they suffered from the negative side of it. I think it's something important to bear in mind sometimes there are negative things that happen in the world, and there's a positive result somehow, somewhere for some people. And both are intended, and both are kind of included in the same package. The Baal Shem Tov also continues, and he says that if you remember in the text that we learned earlier, I believe it was the first text, it says, V'samti pedus, I will place a separation or a redemption, literally, between the Jews and the Egyptians. So if you take the letters of the word pedus, he says, the Baal Shem Tov says, if you take the letters of the word pedus and you flip it around, you can flip it around, what do you get? You get Tidoif. 1 second. Yeah, okay. You get Tidoif, meaning to smite. So you have pedus. The pedus part applies to some people. And then you have Tidoif, which is the same letters, and they also, it's like the same letters are powering what's going on. And for some people, there's a positive result. For others, there is a negative result. And so the Baal Shem Tov's understanding is that this was what took place when the plagues were being enacted. Okay, now let's try to get to the questions we had earlier. But before I do so, I want to take a break and open the floor to any questions if anybody would like to chime in, have any comments or questions, etc. Chaim.
Why were the plagues separated 7 plus 3? Why couldn't we hear all 10 all at once in one part?
That's a very good question. Why don't we hear about all 10 at once? This is the way the Torah split it up. So you would have to go into the mystical to try to understand that. My guess, and this is just a guess, I haven't seen this in any svarim, but I have to believe that it's available somewhere, that in the mystical makeup of the spheres of the divine attributes, they're usually divided by 3 and 7. 7 emotional and 3 intellectual attributes. And I believe that they correspond, that the Parsha of Ve'ira corresponds to the first 7, and the Parsha of Boy corresponds to the 3 uppermost attributes. There's probably a mystical reason, is what I'm saying. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
There's several challenges to Ibn Ezra's idea that, there's something about these first 3 plagues. But what was his argument? What did Ibn Ezra, why would he emphasize that? Wait a minute, the Jews had to suffer, they suffered as much. Like, what's an argument for that?
Yeah, his argument, I'm going to go back to the first text there. His argument is based on this statement here, that when it came to plague number 4, specifically, that's when God says, and I will separate on that day the land of Goshen, meaning the Jews, upon which my people stand. There will be no mixture of noxious creatures there, in order that you know that I am God in the midst of the earth. So Ibn Ezra says, you see, it's very clear in the verse. The verse states it clearly that it was only when it came to the 4th Makkah, when it came to the 4th plague, that's when the Jewish people had been separated. So that's his basis. And it's a pretty strong argument because it's very straightforward in the text. There's clearly something going on. There's something new happening from plague number 4 and onwards, which wasn't happening before. Ibn Ezra is very straightforward. This must mean that the Jews suffered the plagues before.
But didn't Hashem harden Pharaoh's heart? So how does that play into this?
It doesn't, because whether or not God hardened his heart, which is a whole nother discussion, a whole nother theological discussion, the question is only if the Jews suffered it along together with the Egyptians. It's a separate question. Okay, any other questions before we move on? Okay, so let's move on. So here, let's talk about the purpose of the plagues. What was the purpose? Why would God bring all of these plagues there? And if God wanted one thing, he really could have had it. He really could have had it with one plague. What was the purpose of the 10 plagues? So although we're not going to go through all 10 plagues and all the details and everything like that, but we are going to give a smattering of 3 major reasons for the plagues. What were 3 of the major reasons? So the first one is God simply wanted the Jews out. He wanted them redeemed. He was like, Pharaoh, let them go. Let them go. Shalach ami v'yavduni, please send my people and let them serve me. That's the first reason. The second was to punish the Egyptians. The Egyptians deserved punishment. Why did they deserve punishment? Well, God had decreed already before that the Jews would have to be subjugated to the Egyptians. So why would they deserve punishment? And the answer is very simple, because they overdid it. They severely overdid it. And so they deserved punishment. So that would be the second reason why there were plagues. A third reason, and perhaps most importantly, is God wanted to break the perception that Egypt was somehow independent of God and was only subject to their own deities, to their own man-made deities. They believed in the Nile River. They believed that the Nile was the source of their sustenance, and they would serve the Nile as though it were God. And God wanted to penetrate and break through this veneer, this false conception of reality, and have them recognize Sha'ani Hashem, that I am God, God says. God wants them to realize that he is God. So that's the purpose. That is the real purpose of the makas of the plagues. So let's take a look at some of this text, the source text for these different explanations that I just gave. Here in text number 7, we'll begin. So here's the pasuk. For if you do not let my people go, behold, I will incite against you and against your servants and against your people, and in your houses a mixture of noxious creatures, and the houses of Egypt will be filled with a mixture of noxious creatures, as well as the land upon which they are. Why? Because you didn't let them go. You didn't let them free. I'm asking you to allow them to leave. You're refusing. So I'm going to come down on you with enormous pressure by way of these plagues. That's point number 1. Now, as I mentioned before, Hashem had already told Avraham Avinu in what's called the Bris Bein HaBesarim, where he made a covenant with God. God pledged that he would punish the nation who would enslave his children. So these are the words that Hashem said. And God said to Avram, you shall surely know that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. And he concludes, and he says, and also the nation that they will serve, I judge, and afterwards they will go forth with great possessions. So the Egyptians deserved a punishment for what they did. So that was the second element. The second element is that they deserved the punishment for keeping the Jews and enslaving them and oppressing them much more than they should have. That was the second element. But then there was the third element, and that is what we mentioned in the final point that we mentioned, and that is as follows. So said God, with this you will know that I am the Lord. These are the most important words here. B'zos teda Ki ani Hashem. With this you will know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the staff that is in my hand upon the water that is in the Nile, and it will turn to blood. In other words, the purpose of this first plague that we just read about now, the last two lines, transforming the water in the Nile into blood, the purpose of that was that Egypt finally come to recognize the true God, that I am the Lord. Stop serving the Nile, stop serving false deities, recognize that I am the Lord. Okay. So these are three different elements here. Number one, the idea that the Egyptians had to be weakened and had to be destroyed because they refused to allow the Jewish people to leave. Number two, they had to be punished for what they were doing. And number three, ultimately, they had to come to recognize, they had to undergo some kind of spiritual transformation where they came to recognize God. These are three different approaches to dealing with negativity. I don't want to get into the details now, but there are generally three ways of dealing with difficult or negative situations. And the highest, of course, the best, of course, is to transform the adversary by changing their consciousness, by changing the way they reckon, but changing the way they understand things. As we learned last week, that takes time and that takes effort, it takes piecemeal and incremental work, as we learned last week. Now, although all of the plagues were for these three purposes, the first three primarily were for the purpose of letting the Egyptians know that God is God. How so? So Rashi tells us, let's take a look at the next text here. Okay, these are the three reasons. And let's take a look at our text here. He struck their deity and then he struck them. This is the process. When God came to attack the Egyptians, to bring down the Egyptians, he used a strategy. He first struck their deity, and then once their deity was down, then it came time to strike them themselves. So first he began with the Nile, and then he moved to Tzvardea, to the frogs, which also came out of the Nile. And then finally he moved to Kinim, to the lice, to the third Makkah, the third plague of lice. What was so special? What was so interesting or unique about this third plague? So we need to remember that the Egyptians were steeped in occult practices, in magic, black magic, and anything that Moshe tried to do or did, they attempted to replicate. They were able to replicate things up until the third plague, when Moshe brought upon them the plague of the kinim, of the lice. What happened over there? Let's take a look in text number 10b. Let's see how they react. So the necromancers said to Pharaoh, "It is the finger of God." Meaning, they said to Pharaoh, "We see that there's something unique, there's something special about this particular plague that distinguishes it from all the others, from the other ones that we've seen so far. This one," they said, "is the finger of God." Why? So the answer to that question is that black magic, or these forces that were accessible to them through occult practices, could not assert control over entities smaller than a barley, than a sa'ira, than a small barley kernel. And what they came to the conclusion was that because these lice were smaller than that, they were not capable of competing with Moshe. and they recognized that all of their practices, all of their, they went through the entire book or multiple books to see what they could do, and they couldn't do anything. So they recognized that this must be the finger of God. Etzba Elokim. So now, once we've established that the first 3 of the 10 plagues were for the purpose of demonstrating to the Egyptians, Ki Ani Hashem, that I am God, now we can answer the question. We're in the position to answer the question earlier, according to the Ibn Ezra, what would be the purpose of God bringing a plague upon the Jewish people together with the Mitzrayim, together with the Egyptians? Why would they be subject to a plague together with the Egyptians? And so in answer to the question, friends, the explanation is as follows. The Jewish people, who were the Hebrews at that time, they were very much embedded in Egyptian culture, and in a very large part also swayed and influenced greatly by the Egyptian belief system. And so they also had bought into this notion of the Nile being a deity, this idea of perhaps multiple gods, God forbid. And so the message had to come across to them. It had to penetrate their consciousness. It had to invade their society as well, in order that they also be disabused of the notion of idolatry or the Nile being a god. So the Jewish people, at least this is the way we could explain the theory of the Ibn Ezra, the Jewish people also were subject, at least to the first 3 of the 10 plagues. As the Rebbe explains, in text number 11, based on the above, we can understand, as Rashi explains, God brought the first 2 plagues to strike their deity. For this reason, the first 2 plagues had to also affect the Israelites' water. Inasmuch as their deity was being struck by the plagues had to be wherever their deity was to be found. If not, Paro could have thought that this particular section of his deity, the part in the Hebrew territory of Goshen, was indeed greater than the Holy One, blessed be He, heaven forfend. In other words, the Rebbe is here explaining why was it so important that even the part of the Nile or part of the deity, whatever was considered the deity, that was in the Jewish section, also be smitten? Very simple. Because if not, Pharaoh would say, look, the plague is not capable, whoever's bringing this plague is certainly not stronger than the entirety of our deity. Look, our deity is greater. See, in the land of the Jews, it's not there. And so the Jews would make that assumption as well. The Jews would also fall for it and think that, you know what? Actually, this deity that we've been worshiping is pretty strong, pretty tough guy. And so everybody had to be disabused of this notion, of this idea, of these ideas of idolatry, which was the real purpose of the plagues. Okay, let's stop over here and open up the floor for any questions. If anybody would like to ask anything, please unmute yourself and let's hear from you. Go ahead.
I was reading in Hertzchemish. He has like a historical type of background, the way he deals with it. And he talks about something that you're alluding to, that it makes sense that maybe the Jews would suffer the same as the Egyptians, because the idea being, tell me if this makes sense, the idea being that really it's the tyranny and the leaders of Egypt that were to be punished. And the Jews were close to the Egyptians. Even when they left, they were their neighbors, and they were close in their cultural values in a sense too. So in a sense, they were part of them, but they had to learn to be separate from them. He was talking about not so much that the Egyptians themselves any different than the Jews had to suffer, but like also the leaders are the ones that had to suffer.
That's an interesting perspective. Yeah, there's no question that the Jews needed some extra barriers to stay away from the Egyptians. In fact, there's a prohibition in the Torah explicitly forbidding Jewish people from living in the land of Egypt. Like God took us out, and He's like, don't go back there again. And that, of course, raises the question. Just going off on a tangent for a second, it raises the question about how the Rambam, Maimonides, lived there. Maimonides lived in Egypt, and he probably wrote the law in his book about not being able to live in Egypt from Egypt. So it's a whole question for itself. And if I'm not mistaken, I think either the Rambam himself clarifies the question, or it's clarified by somebody later, that he was there because he was pretty much forced to be there. Originally, he wasn't there. Originally, I believe he was in Morocco or Spain. I forget exactly where, and he had to run away. And so he ended up in Egypt, and that was the only place where he could find a parnasa, find a livelihood. And so that's how he was able to stay in Egypt. But in general, there is a prohibition against living in Egypt. So you're making an interesting point where it was necessary to separate between them. Okay, I appreciate that. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I think I have to say something controversial, so we could all jump in and raise the roof. All right, let's move on. So let's take a look at some of the lessons we can learn from this position, this idea, this notion of even the Jewish people for the first 3 plagues needed to experience the plague together with the Egyptians as well. There is a concept in halacha called loy plug. What does loy plug mean? Loy means, of course, no or not to. Plug, miloshin plag. Plag is half. To separate. Loy plug. We don't want to separate. We don't want to divide. We don't want to provide one standard for one instance or one group of people and another standard and another value system for another group of people. We want to have the same value system. We want to have standards that run across the board that are consistent from A to Z. As the Chazal say, if you don't have this, nosato dvorecha lishiurin, which means that you will have placed your words and made them subject to shiurim, meaning measurements. One person will measure up to this standard. The other person won't quite measure up to that standard or measure up to a different standard, and therefore it will have to apply a different law to him. Chazal would rather not have to get into all of those distinctions, because if we did, it would undermine the integrity of the law. So when the sages, meaning the great court, the Sanhedrin, applied a halacha and voted on a halacha, they voted it in such a way where it would not be subject, generally speaking, would not be subject to distinctions in circumstance. Because if you did, in certain cases, the circumstances would be so different, one from the other, that it would simply undermine the integrity of the law. I'll give you an example. Who over here would remember, I should say, that the repetition of the Amidah is actually an enactment of the sages for the purpose of give the opportunity to somebody who does not know how to read to hear the verses and to hear the blessings and respond, amen, and thereby fulfill his obligation. In other words, Chazaras Hashatz is really there for the purpose of the one who doesn't know how to read. That's the way it was established many, many years ago, going back all the way to the time of the Mishnah. So one might ask, what happens if in the congregation that we have, everybody knows how to read? And therefore, there is no purpose or there's no need to have Chazar Sashatz. You know, in pre-war Europe, I'm not sure if this practice continued after, it may have, but certainly in pre-war Europe, there were chazonim, there were cantors who considered the quiet Shemona Esrei the time when they would prepare for their presentation, for the concert that they'd be giving in Chazar Sashatz. So as far as they were concerned, the quiet Shemona Esrei was not there for them. It was just there, for them to prepare, them to to review the text of the tefillas, and their real Shemona Esrei was the Chazar Sashatz. That's kind of in contrast to what we're going to see in a moment. So the question becomes: Could we do without Chazar Sashatz if everybody knows how to read Hebrew? So in text number 12, we read from the Rambam. Rambam was once asked this question, and hopefully when I'm finished reading this text, I'll try to get back to something else that the Rambam writes, which I think should be discussed at least in passing. So here's what happens. He's asked a question. The Rambam was asked the question. He says, question, what is the law with regard to a group of people who are largely proficient in prayer? Should the Chazan repeat the Amidah so as not to embarrass those who aren't proficient, as per the original edict? Or perhaps he should not, so as to refrain from uttering a blessing in vain? After all, most people already discharge their obligation during the silent Amidah. Or perhaps the congregants shouldn't pray at all on their own and leave it to the Chazan instead, so as not to do away with the established sacred tradition. What should we do? So he answers and he says as follows. Inasmuch as our sages instituted that the Chazan should repeat the Amidah for those who are not proficient, the Chazan's repetition is certainly not a blessing in vain, even if there aren't any people in the crowd who did not already discharge their obligation. So even though nobody needs to discharge their obligation by hearing the Chazan, nonetheless, they should continue repeating the Shemona Esrei. This is how we ought to look at any rabbinic edict enacted for whatever reason. The edict is not in place only for as long as the reason still stands. Rather, the edict is now enforced forever in the event that the reason comes up. This means that we ought to follow the edict regardless, for if not, the sage's words would be limited in context. We would then be compelled to look in each synagogue for a person who is not proficient in the prayer, so that the Chazan can then repeat the Amidah for him. Such behavior is obviously not what an edict is all about. I want to mention briefly, in passing, tangentially, that the Rambam almost canceled, actually he didn't just almost cancel, he did cancel for a while, the quiet Shemona Esrei in his shul because there was so much talking. So people would come to shul and they would sit and they would shmooze. Why? Why would they shmooze during Chazar Sashas, during the repetition? Because they thought they had taken care of their obligation in the quiet Shemona Esrei. So when the Chazan was repeating the Shemona Esrei, they would sit and shmooze. It was time to shmooze. Or pull out the Chaim. Start the Kiddush Club. So the Rambam got up and he deactivated the quiet Shemona Esrei. He said, from now on, we're only going to have the loud Shemona Esrei. And that's what happened. Everybody would daven together with the Chazan. Chazan would say Shemona Esrei, and that was it. Why did he do that? In order to strengthen this edict, this established law of the Chazal, to have a repeated Shemona Esrei. Okay, let's talk about another example. The example is in the morning, when we wake up in the morning, so there's an obligation to wash our hands with a special washing cup called a kvart. It usually is, it's a keli for netilas yadayim. It's usually a cup with two handles, and we fill it up with our right hand, put it in our left hand, and wash our right hand first, wash our left hand second, right hand third, left hand fourth, right hand fifth, left hand sixth. That's the way it would go. That's the way it should go. So normally this is an obligation when you wake up in the morning and you've slept during the night. You have an obligation to do this if you slept. Now, what happens if a person didn't sleep? If you were up all night, do you still have to wash the netilas yadayim? So the answer is yes. Why? At least according to some poskim, according to some halachic rulers, halachic authorities, you are obligated. What would be the reason for this? Because without that, we would be applying the law inconsistently, and any inconsistent law falls apart. So let's take this to the personal sphere for a moment. If you're a person who protests against corruption, you don't like corruption, you don't like a certain human behavior, and you're always on the path of protesting against, these human ills, societal ills. So it's critical for you to be consistent about that. You need to be consistent. If you protest against it when this group is doing it, you need to be equally vociferous and protest against it when the other group is doing it. You can't pick and choose. Oh, I went to protest this other person or this other group's failures. And personally, the same also applies to us in our own individual lives. We want to make sure that we are living to our highest ideals in whatever situation, not just in those situations that suit us to live up to those ideals, but we need to live up to those ideals in all situations. There was once a Rosh Yeshiva who was in Gateshead. There's a famous yeshiva in the city of Gateshead in England, where he had inherited the position of Rosh Yeshiva from some elder sage, some elder rabbi, and the elder rabbi would talk in Yiddish, and everybody understood Yiddish. When the new Rosh Yeshiva came along, he would start to speak in English. And so a lot of the students in the yeshiva asked him to go back to the original practice of speaking in Yiddish. So he explained, he said, I could agree to go back to the talking in Yiddish for one part of the general lecture that I give, which is more an ethics discussion. However, when it comes to the second phase of the second portion of the discussion, which is a halachic discussion, there I must speak in English because I have to make sure that everybody understands exactly what I'm saying and exactly what they need to do, because it's a halachic question, it's a legal question, it's a practical question. So he wasn't willing to compromise and speak in Yiddish and force the students to try to understand what he meant. He wanted to make sure that everybody got, when it came to practical halacha, that everybody got exactly what they need to do. There's another manifestation of being unequivocal, which is also something we should bear in mind, and that is Jews are always known as being a stubborn people. We are called by God a Am Kshei Oiref. Am Kshei Oiref means a people. They're described as stubborn. When Jewish people are described as stubborn, people normally understand this as a criticism, but in fact, it is a compliment. It is due to our stubbornness that we have been willing to be killed for our Judaism. This is what the Medrash says. So sometimes we're called, in Am Kshei Oiref, we are people of our kind of the back of our necks, stiff-necked. We're stiff-necked people. But sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a good thing, because if we stick to our guns, if we are consistent about what we stand for what we don't stand for, the standards that we have, then it's a laudable thing. It's a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. And so the idea here is that if we stand by certain standards, certain values that we have, certain morals, say, for example, talking respectfully to parents. So if our standard is we talk only respectfully to our parents, then even if we are tempted to utter something that is perhaps the opposite of that or slightly different than respect, we're going to hold ourselves back because we are stiff-necked. We're stiff-necked people. The same thing could be said about if somebody needs to give up smoking. So then you know that even a single cigarette you can't have even a single cigarette, even though the harm caused by just one cigarette is pretty negligible. A similar concept is applied with regard to learning. One should have a set time to learn Torah. The set time to learn Torah should not be altered, even to allow for a large increase in revenue. This is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law. Even if it means the loss of a potential deal, do not alter the time of your Torah study. Make it something that's chak v'lo yaver, as they say in Hebrew. It is a tenant or it's an established fact, and it does not change. It does not change. And sometimes we fail to give the correct importance to our Torah study sessions. In text number 15, we read from the previous Rebbe. He says there are things that people do only because everyone does it. For example, certain cultural norms are conventionally considered proper and are then crystallized into unalterable laws. Such unreasonable habits ought to be transformed through one's own endeavors. Instead of remaining below reason, they should be elevated above reason. Business commitments, for example, pressing as they may be, do not generally overrule the times that convention prescribes for eating and sleeping. They do, alas, sometimes set aside or even cancel the fixed times that should be regularly scheduled for Torah study and prayer. In other words, he's making the case here is that if you don't give up of your sleep and of your eating in order to be involved in your business, unless like something is really very pressing, then why would you give up time of your learning for those reasons? The Friedrich Rebbe concludes and he says, a man who feels accountable to his soul should ask himself, is there any wisdom in such conduct? For who is the man who knows when his time will come? That's another point that the Friedrich Rebbe throws in at the end, where he says, nobody knows exactly when their time is up. And so why cut corners now? Why compromise the time that you've set aside for learning now, thinking that you're somehow going to be able to make it up at a later point? You won't necessarily be able to make it up at a later point. Okay. And one final point, one final text over here along these lines of taking a strong stand when it comes to certain values or certain morals or character traits. The Rambam has something interesting to say about the way a person needs to go about changing his character if he suffers from a bad fault, a bad character trait. Here's what the Rambam says. See, they didn't give us the English translation here. So I guess here it is. There are temperaments with regard to which a man is forbidden to follow the middle path. He should move away from one extreme and adopt the other. Among these is arrogance. If a man is only humble, he is not following a good path. Rather, he must hold himself lowly and his spirit very unassuming. That is why Scripture describes our teacher Moshe as very humble and not simply humble. Therefore, our sages directed, hold oneself very, very lowly. Also, they declared, whoever is arrogant is as if he denied God's presence, as implied by the verse, and your heart will be haughty, and you will forget God your Lord. Furthermore, they said, Whoever is arrogant should be placed under a ban of ostracism. This applies even if he is only somewhat arrogant. Anger is also an exceptionally bad quality. It is appropriate that one move away from it and adopt the opposite extreme. He should school himself not to become angry, even when it is fitting to be angry. If he should wish to arouse fear in his children and household or within the community, if he is a communal leader and wishes to be angry at them to motivate them to return to the proper path, he should present an angry front to them to punish them, but he should be inwardly calm. He should be like one who acts out of the parts of an angry man in his wrath, but is not himself angry. The early sages said, anyone who becomes angry is like one who worships idols. They also said, whenever one becomes angry, if he is a wise man, his wisdom leaves him. If he is a prophet, his prophecy leaves him. The life of the irate is not true life. That's the Rambam's position. Rambam is telling us here that both with regard to arrogance and with regard to anger, the middle of the path is not good. The approach to the middle of the path is not a good way. Instead, one should go about swinging to the extreme to root out the characteristic of anger, as well as arrogance. These are two things that a person could do without and should do without. So sometimes it takes a strong stand. It takes us to go. We need to go with full force and take an absolute, clear, and unequivocal stance. One other short story I want to mention. You all remember Camp David, the year 2000, when Yasser Arafat met with President Clinton, about the idea of God forbid splitting Jerusalem, dividing Jerusalem, and creating a Palestinian state in the land of Israel. And according to the sources that we have, Arafat actually said something interesting to President Clinton. There's a story in the annals of Jewish history that when King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, was first crowned as king, so there were two women who were women of ill repute, and each of them they lived together in the same house, and each of them bore children. Each of them had a baby, and their babies would sleep with them by night. And what happened was, one of the women mistakenly suffocated her baby at night. She wakes up in the middle of the night. She notices her baby has passed on. So she takes the corpse and she switches him for her friend's baby and takes the friend's baby into her bed. And they wake up in the morning, and her friend wakes up in the morning, and lo and behold, her baby is dead. So they are fighting about whose baby this is. Whose baby is the one that's alive? So the case ends up before King Solomon, before Shlomo HaMelech. And Shlomo HaMelech said, very simple, I'll help you solve this. And he says, bring a sword. So they bring a sword. Says Shlomo HaMelech, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to split the baby, and each of you are going to get half. So the one who was the real mother started crying and screaming. Said, no. Please, if that's what you're going to do, give her away. I want my baby to live. The other woman said, no, you're arguing about the baby. Let's split him. So Shlomo HaMelech said, aha. Now we know who the real mother is. The one who was willing to split the baby, she's not the real mother because she doesn't really care. The one who under no circumstances will allow for this baby to be split, to be killed, That's the real mother, the one who really cares about the baby. Said Arafat that you see the very fact that the Jewish leadership here is willing to entertain the notion of dividing Jerusalem, that shows you that they're not the real mother, that this is not their baby, because they're willing to divide. Of course, we know that Arafat wanted all of Jerusalem, not just the divided Jerusalem. He wanted the whole thing. And that's why ultimately he turned down all of the offers and the peace offers for, a 95% or 98% of everything he was asking for. But anyway, going back to the point here. The point is, friends, that when it comes to certain areas of our life, we need to take unequivocal stances. We need to be very, very clear about where we stand in our personal life and in our behavior. And even though it might seem like, it's probably better to walk a fine line and walk between the raindrops and walk the tightrope and be PC on all ends, everybody likes you. There are some places where that's simply not acceptable. It should not be done. And we need to take a strong stance. We need to take a strong stance wherever it might be, personally, in our own personal life, with regard to our own values, as well as to, events that are happening around the world, or happening in our country, or happening in our neighborhood, or happening in our shul, whatever it might be. Sometimes there needs to be a very clear stance that's taken as to what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, and it's not a chisardin. Shouldn't be viewed as something that is a negative, a disadvantage, or something that's missing, or some kind of lacking, like the person just lacks patience or lacks respect for other people. Sometimes it's important and critical to take a stand and have a position. It's important to have a position, and that comes from a Jewish nature, not from a non-Jewish nature. It comes from being, resolute, from being an am chayeref, being a stiff-necked people. So with that, we close the class. If there's anybody who'd like to ask any questions or comments, please do unmute yourself and feel free to share.
I just had a thought about the discussion we had about the plagues, and the aspect of having some good in. There was something that could be learned from each element of each plague. It reminds me of most discussions about the current COVID pandemic is around, people often reference it as, what plague do we have now? Look how it's affecting everyone. It speaks sort of like, people talk now about, well, there's a silver lining in the experience of the pandemic. So I wonder if there's something connected also to the experience of the 10 plagues, what we've learned from that, to what we could pull out from living with this pandemic, and see the silver lining, that there's something, that there's a positive piece to it.
Is there anything we can learn from this pandemic? That's a great question. I believe there is. There has to be. But I'm not sure exactly what it is, to be honest. I'm sure there has to be. There is. I've had friends who've written pieces on, how COVID is just the exact opposite of everything that we do or we believe in. It basically cuts communication, it cuts interaction, it cuts community. And so we need to, it's forcing us to recalibrate and refocus our energies, especially during the lockdown. That's what was happening during the lockdown. It really forced us to do other things, which perhaps, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I was so happy doing what I was doing during the lockdown. I could exercise and get up when I wanted. I could learn, I could study, I could do this, I could do that. But in terms of the bigger picture, I think we need to. I think that I'm going to have to let that percolate a little bit before I have something more meaningful to say on that.
No, but it kind of links to you were talking about the idea of lice being significant because the sorcerers couldn't. That's the finger of God. You can't see it, and a virus is the same. The virus is the same type of thing. Like we can't see it. It's almost like finger of God. Also, it's worldwide. You know, it's telling us something. You know, the way.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. In that respect, I would agree that there's a very strong message there, and this is something, that many have been saying. Many were saying right at the very beginning, including Rabbi Manis Friedman. I remember this very powerful video that he put out with his message, which was that with all of our advanced understanding and advanced technology and studies and experiments and all the wonderful advancements that have been made in all the human sciences and human wisdom, all of those things were simply not prepared for something that is just so tiny. It's just so much smaller than anything. And they couldn't master it. They couldn't get. It's only now that we're getting a vaccine a year later. And even the vaccine, it's not 100% effective, and some people are suffering from it. Some people are ill. With all of our advancement, we have to realize that we are limited. It reminds us just how limited and finite we really are. I think that is an important message, and recognizing that God ultimately orchestrates everything that takes place in our lives and in the world. I think that is certainly an important message, a critical message to take home. Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from anybody else that's still with us? If not, we'll close the class now, and we'll wish everybody a wonderful week. And thank you for joining us. And I hope to see you, God willing, next week, same time, same place, and same channel. All the best.